Welcome to the channel. If this is your first time visiting, we warmly thank you for stopping by. Here, we share real-life stories with deep meaning, stories about justice, courage, and the strength of community, especially for those who value morality, integrity, and doing what's right. If this message speaks to your heart, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any of our upcoming meaningful stories. A simple like and share from you isn't just support for us, it's a powerful way to spread positive messages to your friends, loved ones, and the wider community. You are the reason we keep telling these stories. You give us hope. You inspire us to keep going. Thank you for being here with us. Now, let's dive into today's story. The sky was still draped in early morning mist when Jack Donovan jolted out of bed, stirred by a strange feeling he couldn't quite name. It wasn't a sound, it wasn't a dream, it was a smell, sharp, chemical, and completely foreign to his backyard garden. The odor seeped through the slightly open window, making him frown as he silently stepped into the hallway. Jack had lived in Maple Ridge for 3 years, and never once had the morning air unsettled him like this. As he walked down the back steps, a faint breeze carried the acrid scent straight to his face. But it wasn't the sunrise that greeted him. It was the lake, the one thing on his property he valued above all else. Now it was cloaked in an unnatural, murky gray. No longer reflecting the gentle light of dawn, the once peaceful water looked more like a stagnant pit of death. Jack stood frozen, his initial confusion quickly turning to alarm as he noticed fish floating near the shore, lifeless, and some still twitching weakly, like they were trying to escape something unseen. He knelt down and scooped a handful of water. A slick, oily film clung to his skin, making him shudder. This wasn't natural water. He knew it, not just from the smell and color, but because he had poured his heart into that lake. He'd restored it by hand, cultivated aquatic plants, monitored its water quality every week. Jack never used pesticides. No one else had access to the fenced-in backyard but him. And yet, the grass had yellowed. The weeping willow at the water's edge, once draping gently like a curtain of sorrow, now looked as if scorched by an invisible fire. Every living thing around the lake was quietly dying, without warning. Rusty, his loyal dog, sniffed the air, whimpered softly, and backed away, something he had never done before. Jack felt a chill crawl up his spine. The silence hung heavy, as if the entire garden was holding its breath, witnessing some dreadful truth rise to the surface. This wasn't nature turning hostile. Someone had attacked his lake. He turned his head toward the distant fence, the boundary between his land and the rest of Maple Ridge. A dark suspicion slowly took shape in his mind. He didn't speak it aloud, but one name echoed like a whisper through his thoughts: Karen. Before we continue uncovering the truth behind the strange signs around the lake, if you find this story engaging and meaningful, please don't forget to hit the like button, share the video to spread the message, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any upcoming stories. Your support is what motivates us to keep bringing thoughtful, authentic, and impactful content. Now, let's follow Jack as he begins his journey to investigate the hidden forces behind the peaceful facade of this neighborhood. After regaining his composure, Jack went back inside, opened the cupboard, and retrieved a glass jar. He carefully scooped some water from the lake and labeled it, "Water sample, 6:30 a.m." This was no longer just a personal concern. Something deeper was happening, and Jack knew he had to start documenting everything. He had never been a suspicious man, but what he witnessed that morning felt like a harsh wake-up call. What he once believed to be safe and stable was now shaking at its very foundation. His first instinct was to call the city. The operator said she would forward the report to the environmental department, but her tone was frustratingly indifferent. "It might just be a natural algae bloom," she said casually, as if the death and decay in his lake were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Unwilling to accept such a dismissive answer, Jack decided to conduct his own investigation. He dug through property records, irrigation maps, and past emails from the HOA he had stored in his inbox. Among the usual notices he had previously ignored, one small detail made him pause. 3 weeks earlier, the HOA had sent out an internal newsletter mentioning irrigation adjustments in border areas to ensure landscape uniformity. The phrasing sounded harmless at first, but Jack knew his property was one of the only border areas still under private ownership around the lake. The more he researched, the more isolated he realized he was. Nearly every parcel surrounding the lake had been absorbed by the HOA, except his. It brought to mind something Karen had said in passing a few months earlier, after he declined her offer to harmonize his landscape with the rest of the neighborhood. She had smiled then, but her eyes held both disappointment and something calculating. "You'll see, Jack. It's always inconvenient not to blend in." That sentence now echoed in his mind with startling clarity. Was it an observation or a warning? Jack stepped across the wooden fence, glancing into the backyards of neighboring homes. Everything looked immaculate, identical, with sprinklers operating on schedule like a well-oiled machine. He focused on the irrigation heads near the edge of his property, an area he hadn't installed himself. Those nozzles could very well have been the point of entry for the chemical that poisoned his lake. Back inside, he grabbed a notepad and pen, beginning to record everything he'd just discovered. Every clue, every fleeting memory, every seemingly innocent remark was now potential evidence. He didn't yet have solid proof, but he knew he wasn't imagining things anymore. And while the full picture wasn't clear, there was only one name at the top of his suspect list: Karen. Her name had appeared numerous times in the HOA's emails, and Jack decided it was time for a face-to-face confrontation. The HOA office wasn't far from his house, a modest building tucked between two rows of symmetrically planted ornamental trees, a reflection of the obsession with order held by the person running it. As he walked in, he was greeted by a young receptionist who immediately stiffened when he asked to speak with Karen. "She's busy at the moment," the woman said, casting a quick glance toward a closed conference room. "I'll wait," Jack replied, his tone leaving no room for less than 5 minutes later. Karen emerged. She looked exactly as he remembered, wearing a pastel blazer, a pencil skirt that hugged the knees, her blonde hair perfectly curled, and that same overly polite smile that never reached her eyes. But something in her gaze kept Jack on edge. It was the look of someone used to manipulation, someone who knew how to control a room without ever raising Jack Donovan, she said, as if reading the name of someone barely worth remembering. "I heard there's been a bit of trouble with the lake on your property." "It's more than a bit of trouble," Jack replied. "It's a serious case of contamination. Dead fish, withered plants, water murky like oil. I want to know if the HOA has conducted any activity near the lake in the past few weeks." Karen blinked, then smiled again, this time the smile of someone who had already prepared her answer. "We always follow environmental regulations to the letter, but if you're seeing issues, perhaps it's something in the groundwater. Other homeowners have experienced similar things." Jack looked her directly in the eye. "I've checked. My property is the only one affected, and conveniently, I'm also the only one who hasn't signed the HOA's landscape unification agreement." Karen's eyes flashed, just for a moment. The polished facade slipped, revealing the cold calculation underneath. "Well," she said in a measured tone, "it's unfortunate when someone feels isolated simply because they choose not to cooperate with the community." That wasn't an explanation. It was a warning, wrapped in velvet. Jack rose from his seat, muttered a mechanical thank you, and walked out of the office. But as he stepped back into the sunlight, he knew without a doubt what he had only suspected before. Karen wasn't just a typical HOA manager. She was a strategist, a chess player, and every house in this neighborhood was just another pawn on the board she intended to control. The poisoned lake was only a glimpse into something much larger, and now Jack had become the obstacle she needed to eliminate. In the days that followed, Jack began to feel something he never expected to encounter in a modern suburban neighborhood, a quiet but persistent hostility. His mailbox was found open twice, though there were no signs of forced entry. Warnings from the HOA started pouring in, first about grass growing outside regulation length, then about trash placed out on the wrong collection day. Each notice came with threats of fines. Every slip of paper felt like a reminder. You're being watched. Every action was being monitored, judged, and recorded. Jack knew this wasn't coincidence. It was a tactic, a calculated pressure campaign. And behind it all, without a doubt, was Karen. he went back to speak with Tom Grady, an older neighbor living a few houses down. Tom had once worked in urban planning and had long voiced concerns about the HOA's overreach. When Jack told him about the lake incident, Tom wasn't surprised. Instead, he pulled out an old folder, maps showing the development plans for Maple Ridge and records of land purchases dating back several years. "Did you know," Tom said, "that over the past 3 years, the HOA has quietly acquired more than half of the lots surrounding the lake? That lake used to be community property before the neighborhood was subdivided. Now, only a few privately owned plots remain, and you're one of them." Each document revealed another piece of the puzzle. The HOA didn't just want to manage the community, they wanted to own it. And Karen, with the power she wielded, was systematically eliminating anything she considered an obstacle. Jack wasn't just the last man protecting his lake. He was now the next target. The following day, Jack received a thick envelope marked with the HOA's seal. Inside was a formal notice demanding environmental remediation and a fine of $10,000. The letter accused him of polluting shared community aesthetics and negatively impacting neighborhood property values. Most absurd of all, the HOA provided no concrete evidence, just a few vague, low-quality photos taken from a distance, showing what they claimed was discolored water. Jack stared at the bolded number at the bottom of the page. This wasn't psychological pressure anymore. This was a direct hit, disguised under layers of legal formality. He stood at a crossroads. Surrender and move away, like so many others before him, or resist. But resistance meant going head-to-head with an entire system built to crush dissent from individuals like him. Jack clenched the letter in his fist, then lifted his gaze toward the lake. His peace had already been taken, but if peace required unconditional submission, he was ready to walk another path, even if it meant standing alone against a machine called the HOA. It didn't take Jack long to realize that if he wanted to stand a chance against Karen and the looming shadow of the HOA, he needed evidence, solid, irrefutable proof that couldn't be brushed aside with smooth words or buried under legal formalities. He started by installing a network of security cameras around his property, assigning each one a unique nickname and setting up automatic data backups. He also kept meticulous notes of every incident, from the moment the lake water changed color to the warning letters he received, even the strange figures he spotted lingering near his home at night. Still, personal documentation wasn't enough. Jack needed someone who understood the law, someone who could turn his sense of injustice into a legitimate legal case. He sought out Emily Rhodes, an environmental attorney known for helping residents in another neighborhood win a case against an HOA accused of property manipulation. At first, Emily was reserved, flipping through the materials Jack brought her, but the deeper she read, the more serious her expression became. "You're up against an organization that's not only violating your individual rights," Emily said, "but also showing signs of willful environmental misconduct. If we can identify the chemicals used and trace who authorized their release, this could become a landmark case." With her help, Jack sent water samples to an independent lab. A few days later, the results came back. The lake contained dangerously high levels of atrazine, a tightly regulated herbicide. What stood out most was that this chemical isn't available in any standard consumer gardening products. Only large-scale maintenance crews, like the ones contracted by the HOA, could legally access it in such quantities. Emily advised Jack to remain completely silent while they gathered more evidence. What they needed now was one final piece: a person who could directly confirm the HOA's misconduct. That opportunity arrived in the form of an anonymous email sent to Jack's private inbox. It contained only one sentence: "I know what happened to the lake. Meet me at 9 p.m. behind the library parking lot." That evening, under the dim glow of a streetlight, Jack met Eli Navarro, a former technician who had worked for the HOA. Eli revealed he had been fired after questioning the chemical runoff near Jack's property. More importantly, he still had a copy of the irrigation schedule, which had been suspiciously altered during the exact week the contamination occurred. As Jack looked at Eli, a sense of balance began to return for the first time in days. With lab data, a credible eyewitness, and a seasoned attorney on his side, he knew the fight had officially begun. And this time, he wasn't alone. 3 weeks later, when the annual HOA community meeting was held at the Maple Ridge Town Hall, Jack entered the crowded room with a completely different mindset. He was no longer a resident under pressure. He had a clear purpose: to expose the truth. Every seat had been filled early. Homeowners showed up in greater numbers than in previous years, many whispering about rumors surrounding the poisoned lake and a potential lawsuit in the works. But no one knew Jack hadn't come just to raise questions. He had come with evidence. Karen, as usual, sat at the head of the table, impeccably dressed in a teal suit, her gaze sweeping the crowd as if she still held complete control. Her voice was as sweet as ever as she opened the meeting, emphasizing that unity and order remain the top priorities of our community. But just as she moved to the agenda item on neighborhood code violations, Jack stood up. "I'd like to speak," he said, his voice clear and firm. Karen raised an eyebrow slightly. "Of course, Mr. Donovan. I trust you've reviewed the speaking procedures for this meeting?" Jack ignored the sarcasm. He stepped up to the podium carrying a folder, a small projector, and a USB drive. "I won't take much of your time," he began, "but I believe everyone here deserves to know what's really been happening behind those violation notices and so-called partnership invitations." The lights in the room dimmed as the screen lit up. Jack presented the evidence one by one: a video of the lake on the day of contamination, photos of dead fish, and a lab report identifying the chemical presence. Then he switched to the irrigation map provided by Eli, showing how the HOA's system had been reconfigured to direct runoff straight into his property the night before the incident. A murmur spread through the room. A few residents turned to one another with looks of growing alarm, but Jack wasn't finished. "And this," he said, inserting a second USB drive, "is an audio recording from an internal HOA meeting where a technician questioned the use of atrazine around the lake and was told to stay quiet if he wanted to keep his job." Karen's voice echoed from the speakers, clear, cold, calculated. The room fell utterly silent. Karen stood up, her face briefly showing signs of strain before she composed herself. "There must be some misunderstanding. These files could have been altered or taken out of context." "Let the courts decide," Jack interrupted, "because every bit of this evidence has already been submitted to legal counsel and the press." The silence quickly gave way to angry whispers, then raised voices. People stood up, demanding answers, calling for a full audit of the HOA's operations. Karen said nothing more. She gathered her papers and stepped away from the podium in silence, a stark contrast to her usual confident demeanor. As for Jack, he quietly left the hall while the debate continued. He didn't need to win with words. The truth was out, and the community was finally awake. Less than a week after the explosive community meeting, local newspapers across the area ran front-page stories about the events in Maple Ridge. Photos of the contaminated lake, along with audio clips of Karen's cold, calculating remarks, appeared under bold headlines in the community investigation section. The Department of Environmental Quality launched an immediate inquiry, and the city attorney's office issued subpoenas demanding all HOA operational records from the past 3 years. Karen was suspended from her position immediately pending investigation. Meanwhile, the remaining members of the HOA board, who had long followed her lead in silence, now found themselves under public scrutiny, facing questions from the community. What did they know, and how long had they kept quiet? Jack, meanwhile, did not seek the spotlight. He declined interview requests from the media and instead agreed to host a quiet gathering with fellow residents by his lake. A place once marked by isolation and quiet threats had now become a symbol of hope and unity. Neighbors brought seedlings, fresh soil, and even a team of college volunteers who helped clean, detoxify, and begin restoring the lake's ecosystem. Emily Rhodes, sharp and dedicated as ever, filed a civil lawsuit against the HOA. Not long after, a judge approved the case and ordered the HOA to compensate Jack and the other affected residents for damages. The fine was significant, but the impact went beyond money. Maple Ridge had now become a cautionary tale, a living example of how unchecked power within a homeowners association could be abused if the community didn't stand up. A new election was held, this time organized and overseen by the residents themselves. New faces emerged, people not looking to rule, but to serve. Jack was invited to join the new board, but he declined. "I just want to take care of my land," he said. "And if that helps others do the same, then that's enough. By the end of that spring, the lake slowly began to heal. Fish were reintroduced. The weeping willow at the shore sprouted new leaves. Children once again played on the grass, no longer under watchful, judgmental eyes. Near the lake's edge, the residents placed a small stone plaque, engraved with the words, "Freedom doesn't come from compliance. It begins with someone who dares to say no." And just like that, from a poisoned patch of water, a community awakened. And Jack, he didn't just reclaim his right to live by his own values, he had sparked a lasting change that could never again be poisoned by power. In the seemingly peaceful world of quiet suburban neighborhoods, there are sometimes hidden forces that manipulate everything under the guise of order and regulation. The story of Jack and his battle with the HOA isn't merely a dispute over property. It symbolizes something much greater, the courage to stand up against injustice, no matter how powerful the opposition may seem. Many older adults have lived through times when social order was considered paramount. We were taught to comply, keep the peace, avoid conflict. But time has shown us that silence is not always the answer. Injustice often grows stronger when no one is willing to say no. Jack, though not a natural fighter, chose to confront the system when truth was distorted, when his property, and more importantly, his dignity, was violated. It's a decision many of us may have hesitated to make, but this story reminds us, even one steadfast person can shake an entire system. The deeper lesson here is this: justice doesn't always come from above. Sometimes it begins with an ordinary individual, in an ordinary home, with a heart that refuses to accept what's wrong. For seniors, especially those living in HOA-governed communities or similar management systems, this is a timely reminder. We don't need to raise our voices or display physical strength, but we can use wisdom, awareness, and our sense of civic duty to defend our rights. Take notes, observe, ask questions, and if necessary, speak up. One small act can open the door to meaningful change. This story also reminds us that real power doesn't lie in control, but in the support of a community. When Jack began, he stood alone, but truth drew others to him, people willing to listen, to stand beside him. Age does not weaken our role as defenders of what's right. It deepens our understanding of why it matters. And finally, Jack's lake, once poisoned, was restored. It became a symbol of renewal and hope. Much like our own lives, no matter how many scars the past has left, no matter how exhausted we may feel at times, there is always a chance for rebirth if we never lose faith in what is right.